Welcome back for Season 2, Episode 5. Thank you for joining me, guys. I've become increasingly fascinated with unexplained phenomena in the western U.S., especially since relocating to the coastal region of Oregon, and I've been taking steps to integrate some of that into the show. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming John Olson on the program. John's well known for his books on Stranger Bridgerland, an area in northern Utah that's home to some pretty unusual and unnerving activity. His second book, Beyond Stranger Bridgerland, panned out a bit to also include other areas like Idaho and Wyoming, for example, but it still very much centers on places in northern Utah like Logan Canyon, Cache Valley, and Hiram. John included several of his own stories in these books, but most of the content centers around everyday ordinary people in these areas that have experiences they can't explain. The books were released in 2017 and 2018, respectively, and John actually has a new book coming out soon that I'm very excited to talk about as well. The Bridgerland books are quick, extremely fun reads, and the stories he featured are really gripping. They include UFOs, Bigfoot, and plenty of other cryptids, black-eyed kids, time slips, and paranormal activity of all kinds. They're really memorable stories because they have this great mixture of authenticity, weirdness, and dread. Even though most of the accounts are fairly brief, a few of them really stuck with me. Most people probably think of the Uinta Basin and Skinwalker Ranch, of course, when it comes to unusual activity in Utah, and that's fair. But the Bridgerland books really make a strong case for northern Utah, and I can't wait to learn more about the coverage in his next book. I'd like to begin by telling a story about a man named John. John always loved motorcycles. He had owned one since his teens, and in his early 20s, this would have been around 2005. His uncle sold him his mint-condition Honda 550, and John just adored the thing. He rode it everywhere. 2 months later, he's hit by a car. He separates 3 ribs, but luckily he's otherwise okay. The bike isn't so lucky, it's totaled, but the insurance money finally comes through a few months later, and John's really excited to go shopping for another motorcycle. He takes his time, looks at several, but none of them really feel right. One day, John, his wife, and 3-year-old son go to the old shopping center in Logan, Utah. As soon as he walks in, he senses something isn't right. He notices there aren't many people there, but then he catches sight of a man that he doesn't recognize dressed in a gray t-shirt and Levi's at the other end of an aisle who's staring intently at John. John smiles with a nod and goes on his way. As he makes his way through the store, he continues to catch glimpses of this man staring at him. And it makes him uncomfortable, but he doesn't want to make a scene or upset his wife. He continues on. And they're just about finished. His wife goes to grab milk while John makes his way to the cereal, and they're just going to meet up at the register. Standing in the aisle, looking at the cereal, John feels somebody's presence behind him. He turns around to see the same man standing right in front of his son, who's sitting in the shopping cart. John smiles and nods hello again. He now notices the man's gray t-shirt and Levi's are ripped and dirty. He has what looks like road rash on his arm, and it's fresh, like he just walked away from some kind of an accident. The man looks from John to his son and smiles. He says, "You have a beautiful family." John smiles and thanks the man, who turns and looks at John, his face turning grave. He says, "I had a family once, but I don't get to see them anymore since the accident." At that moment, John's blood runs ice cold. The man locks eyes with John and continues in a profound, convincing voice and says, "You should not buy another motorcycle. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" John knows in his core, this is not just some random person sharing a story. This is an obvious warning. All John can manage to get out is, yes. The man then smiles, looks at his son, then walks down the aisle, turns the corner, and John follows him, somehow knowing he'd be gone as soon as he rounds the corner, and sure enough, he's completely vanished from sight. As soon as they get back into the car, John asks his wife if she ever saw this guy, and she insists she didn't. To this day, John has never ridden or purchased another motorcycle. Although he misses it a great deal, he believes the man that he encountered that day at the old shopping center was a well-meaning spirit who intervened because he didn't want to see John suffer the same fate that he did. And he's heeded that warning every day since then. And of course, I put a lot of emphasis on the effect these things have on us. And I can't think of many better examples than that. That's a pretty clear and present warning from something, somewhere. I don't know what. And I'm also not sure if this supposed spirit foresaw an actual event in which John dies in another accident, or if it just wanted to reach out because it somehow knew John or that he'd already been in a close call once before. I don't know, but this illustrates just how profoundly we can be touched by this other side. It can change the course of your entire life, or your death in this case. Without further ado, let's head into the ether with author John E. Olson. Big fan of the books, John. Do you mind if we just sort of jump right into the first two here?
Yeah, no, that'd be great.
Awesome. And by the way, is it pronounced Bridgerland or Bridgerland?
Either way.
Okay.
It depends on whether you say it with the slang or not. Either way is acceptable. So.
Okay, perfect. Of all the stories you featured in your first two books then, John, can we maybe start with one of the stories that stuck with you the most and talk about that a bit?
Yeah, you bet. In my books, I've got, variations of stories, some ghosts, some paranormal, like UFOs, Bigfoot, all kinds of things like that. Mm-hmm. One that stands out to me quite a bit on the ghost side of things, I remember I had a friend who introduced me to this lady and said, she has got a great story. You've got to interview her. And so I did. I got the opportunity to interview her, and she told me a story that happened to her. Her and her husband had been married for quite a while, and he'd finally finished school and started working, and they were able to move into a fairly new house. And she was really excited about being able to decorate and get everything ready in the house. They had 3 children, one 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 18-month-old. And she decorated the whole house, and she wanted to do her front room. And so she one thing that she loved is antiques and kind of the rustic look. And her mother and her had gone to a antique mall, and she was looking around, and this bag really caught her eye, and it was a rather bigger old leather bag, and she picked it up, and it had a name on the front that said Schruber on the front of it. And she looked inside, and it was just full of old tools that she originally thought were woodworking tools, but come to find out later they were actually cobbler's tools.
Yeah, right.
But she fell in love with it and brought it home. And in the front room, she found a nice spot to display the bag and lay out some of the tools. And everything was fine for the first couple weeks. And then she started noticing she would go into the front room and the bag would be packed again. The tools wouldn't be laid out anymore. They were packed in the bag. And so they were too high for her kids to reach. So she asked her husband. Her husband wasn't doing it. And so she would lay them out again. And this had happened a couple times through a couple weeks. And she thought that was rather strange. And one night, her and her husband were laying in bed, getting ready for bed. He was almost asleep. She was reading a book. And they had a baby monitor in for the 18-month-old daughter. And the daughter started fussing a little bit, and she perked up to listen. She was trying to let her baby learn to soothe herself and sometimes cry herself to sleep. So she was just listening, and all of a sudden she started hearing a deep male voice singing in the room. And she sat up in bed and listened, and sure enough, it was a, a male voice singing to her daughter, and she couldn't understand the words. They were in a different language, and she woke her husband up, and they both jumped up and ran down the hall and into the baby's room, and there was nobody there. Her husband searched the house, checked all the doors, everything was locked, and so they got calmed down and went back to bed. And sure enough, a couple nights later, the exact same thing happened again. Again, they searched the house, everything, and her husband convinced her it must be a cross connection to the baby monitor. Yeah. But she thought it was really strange that it only happened when her daughter started to fuss in the room.
Right.
She tried to shrug it off a little, and a couple days later, she's in the kitchen working, and around the front room, her 3-year-old boy is in there playing, and he's talking to somebody, and she thinks, well, 3-year-olds, they have imaginary friends, and then all of a sudden she hears a male voice speaking to her son, and she runs into the front room, and there's nobody there except for her son, and she says, "Who's in here with you?" And her young son says, "Oh, it's the grandpa man. It's the grandpa man that talks to me." And so she scoops up her 3-year-old and sits down and talks to him, and he says, "It's the grandpa man that talks to me. He's got a big mustache and grandpa hat." And she thinks that's really strange. So a few things like this go on for a couple weeks. And then one night she's laying in bed and she hears a really bad crash in the front room. And her husband jump up and run down the stairs and into the front room. And the lights are off, but you can see in the front room from the lights on the street. And the bag has been dumped off the shelf and the tools are across the floor. And standing there near them is a gentleman. And he's got a mustache, big handlebar mustache, and older clothes, and an old style hat. And he's just looking at the tools. And she's kind of froze. And then the spirit seems to notice them, and he looks up and looks at them with a really sad face. And they flip on the light, and he's gone. Yeah. So they scoop up the tools. Her husband puts them in the garage, and she puts 2 and 2 together that's where the spirit has come from. It's connected to the tools, and she eventually returns the tools. She felt bad because she didn't feel like it was necessarily an evil spirit whatsoever, but that he was connected to the tools, and she just did not want that in her house. But when she did finally get rid of the tools, sure enough, all of the activity in the house stopped.
Right. Yeah, though that's a great story. I'm glad you touched on that one because it features one of those elements that has always kind of confused me, and that is the attachment.
Right.
But it's definitely something that comes up an awful lot in these stories. And of course, the fact that this entity wasn't malevolent at all, like we're so used to hearing about, is quite the contrary. It was actually trying to comfort that child. So yeah, I found that one a very interesting story as well. One of my favorite aspects to your books, John, is the majority of the stories are genuinely unnerving. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about them that really grabbed me and pulled me in. And I'm curious, man, how did you pick and choose which stories to include and not include? What did that selection process look like for you?
So it's interesting when I have people come to me with their story and I interview them. I collect all of the stories, but when I'm choosing which ones to put in my book, I like ones that are going to grasp you, that are going to really get a hold of you. And at the same time, I kind of enjoy the stories that are they're not necessarily somebody who was out there looking for the paranormal, but the paranormal came looking for them. They stumbled into it on their own, because that seems to have an aspect to it where it relates to people, everyday people who are just trying to lead their life, and then all of a sudden they stumble into the unknown.
Exactly. And I think that's what also helps lend that extra air of credibility to the stories too.
Yeah, yeah. I just love that aspect of the paranormal.
Yeah, as do I. In fact, I find it to be one of the most intriguing aspects of them all. Another story I really wanted to touch on here, if it's okay with you, is Jacob's. In 1988, near Bear Lake Valley, Jacob was out hunting for deer, but he encountered something else. Can you expound on this one for us, John?
Yeah, so he was planning on going hunting with his dad, and he his dad got sick. He wasn't able to go with him, and so he decided to go up on his own, and ended up going to a place here in the Cache Valley near where I live. There's a valley just to the east where Bear Lake sits. It's a giant glacier lake up there. And he was hunting. He sat up in a place where he could watch the area. And he is glassing with his binoculars. And all of a sudden, he notices in a little area below him a gentleman standing in the middle of this opening between the trees. And he was just kind of dumbfounded because he didn't see the guy walk out there. He wasn't really sure, how he got there. And so he watched him for a little while, and the guy never moved. He was wearing a suit, and which is really odd to be up in the mountains and wearing a suit.
Right.
And so after a little while, he decides he's going to walk down and find out what's going on with this guy. So he walks down and heads into the little opening where the guy is. And he's not being quiet because he doesn't want to disrupt the guy. And as he gets closer, again, his clothes are he's wearing a suit, kind of off color. Everything just seems really weird about it. And he's noticing a smell in the air, which later he realizes is almost an ozone type smell. Nothing that you would necessarily get in the forest when you're out hunting.
Right.
And when he finally gets the gentleman's attention, the gentleman turns and looks at him and is really surprised that he's there. And the gentleman had, he looks human, and yet his facial features, things just don't hit him well. And he asks the guy, he's like, "Are you okay?" And the guy looks at him, he says, "I seem to have misplaced myself." And which, nobody really talks like that. He noticed that the guy didn't talk with, he knew English, but it was almost like he'd learned English a different way. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Yeah." He says, "Are you lost?" And he says, "Yeah, I seem to have misplaced myself." He says, "Can you tell me the nearest township?" And, which again, he's like, that's really kind of weird. But he points him in the direction of the nearest town, which is down in the valley, and tells him there's a road, you can go down there. And the gentleman thanks him, and he's got a briefcase with him and everything, which is it's just really out of place for in the mountains in the middle of the fall. And he turns and walks off. And I remember when I interviewed the gentleman that was telling me about it, he walked around the edge of the field at first just to see where the guy had walked in from, but he couldn't see any of the tracks of where he had come in. It just seemed like he had just appeared there. And so he decides he's going to leave for the day. This is just too much for him. And so he hikes out to his vehicle, and he realizes he's even – like the time frame that this all should have happened should have been an hour and a half tops, but he's missing a good 3 hours of time, and he's just confused as to what has happened, what's going on, and he drives home just confused as to this gentleman, where he came from, where his 3 hours went to. The entire thing just was really unnerving. And he mentioned several times the gentleman's broad smile and how weird that was to him. And even looking back years later, he said it's the strangest thing that had ever happened to him in his life, And he from then on, he actually refused to go hunting alone just because of that. It wasn't
Yeah.
that he felt threatened by the guy, but that's just the whole thing seemed to like out of an X-Files story, something that just
Yeah.
doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be something that sticks with you.
Yeah.
And I don't blame the poor guy. I think I would also go with a buddy next time.
Yeah.
Generally not a good idea to go out into the woods alone. So,
Right.
yeah, good call there. One thing I noticed was a lot of similarities between what goes on in northern Utah and the activity that takes place in the Uinta Basin, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But what do you think ties that all together? Why is this same bizarre melting pot of activity taking place over 200 miles away?
It's hard to say exactly what. In my first two books, I actually don't have any stories from the Uinta Basin, but my new book that's coming out, I do.
Nice.
And I've interviewed, a lot of people from that area, and what I find is really interesting is as I tell stories starting here from the Cache Valley, northern Utah area, that it is weird how all the way through the Rocky Mountains, all the way down through into the Uintas and all the way around is very similar stories and just strange things that go on. And some of them seem interconnected and some of them don't, with UFOs and cryptids and ghosts. And it just seems like almost like there's a vein running through the Rocky Mountains that just resonate with the paranormal, and it's just really exciting, actually.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, it really does make you wonder what connects it all. Moving on to you, John, I understand you grew up in an old haunted house, and I suppose that would be kind of a given that you're going to have some odd experiences there, but it all seemed to start with the stair monster. Can you tell us about this character?
Yeah, you bet. So, like you mentioned, I grew up in a home that was over 100 years old, or it was close to 100 when I was growing up. It was built in the 1880s, early 1880s.
Okay.
And as I grew up in the home, around the age of 8 or so, I recognized that there were things going on in my house that didn't seem to go on anywhere else. And I have an older sister, it's about 4 years older than me. And one of the very first things I remember is talking to her about what we called the stair monster. From the main floor to the second level where our bedrooms were is a really steep staircase. And in fact, like if it was built today, there's no way it would pass code because it's so steep.
Right.
And you could be downstairs, you could be upstairs, and any time of the day, you could all of a sudden hear either heavy footsteps going up and down or fast footsteps going up and down. And in fact, the stairs run over the one bathroom that was there, and you could be in the restroom, and it's the middle of the day, and you're all alone, and you hear the footsteps run up and down the stairs. And so one of us coined the term the stair monster, which we kind of started attributing to all of the phenomenon that was going on. But as little kids, you I guess kind of make up words or whatever that help you associate, and so
Sure.
we went with stair monster.
Yeah, and I understand you and your family have both continued to experience things there at that home throughout the years. I'm curious, have you been able to identify a possible source or a previous resident there?
Yeah, so interesting enough, I remember when I was in 8th grade, right around 8th grade, and I came home from school and I made myself a sandwich and plopped down on the couch to watch a television show. And before I could get the TV on, something caught my eye. And this was the first time that I saw this apparition, which was a tall figure with a white shirt and overalls and a wide-brimmed hat. And I couldn't see the facial features, but I could see through him, but I could see enough of that to recognize the hat, the overalls, the white shirt. And he walked in and sat down in a rocking chair across from me and started rocking back and forth. And I closed my eyes and counted to 10 and opened my eyes, and he was gone. The rocking chair continued to rock for just a minute and then stop. And then I got out and left. I got out of the room. Well, fast forward, and then I'm not the only one who has seen this individual. My mother has, my sister has, my dad has. So if you fast forward, several years from then, my grandmother passed away. She lived a block away. My family on my dad's side all grew up in the same town. I have roots that go way back, and the house that I grew up in had actually been in my family back several generations.
Okay.
And when my grandmother passed away, we were going through some of the really old photo albums. And I remember we flipped the page, and my breath just caught in my throat, because there, standing near my house, was this black and white photo of a gentleman, tall, skinny, white shirt, overalls, and wide brimmed hat. And come to find out, it was a great great uncle of mine who was one of the original owners of the house near the turn of the century, who had a farm down there. So it was at that point I realized that's one of the entities, or one of the ghosts that live there, is this gentleman that used to live there.
Oh, interesting.
And I would love to have that picture for my book, and I'm still going around to my uncles and my aunts and find out who ended up with that book, because I want that picture so bad, or at least a copy of it, but haven't been able to. But yeah, so just having seen that picture, realizing, and then going back and realizing that's who owned the home when it was a farmhouse, I've connected that's one of the entities that live in the house that used to live there.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. You're able to get that confirmation later on. And that was the gentleman in the book that you refer to as the tall man, right?
Yes, correct. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. And so you've basically had this lifelong relationship with the paranormal. It's been there for better or worse, right? Mm-hmm. Does it ever become so second nature to you that you kind of lose interest at all? Or is this something you're still drawn to today as much as you were when you were a kid?
I'm just as drawn to it as when I was a kid. The interesting thing is, though, that it doesn't frighten me. I mean, it did sometimes when I was a child, but having grown up in that house and seeing all the things that I have, and even to today, my parents still own the house, and there's still things going on there. I'm still drawn to it. It's interesting that I just don't have the fear. I have people ask me when they read my books, they interview me, they talk to me, they said, doesn't any of it scare you, even if it happens today? And I'm like, I'm actually more afraid of living people than I am of the dead, because, it's just, to me, it's just fascinating. I just love it.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And I'm glad to hear that's the case for you, because I hear this a lot. People that encounter these kind of things on a regular basis, they maybe initially had some level of fear, but in reality, there wasn't anything to be afraid of. It was more of a misunderstanding of what the phenomenon is and what its intentions are, those sorts of things. So having said that, I'm really looking forward to your upcoming book, and it's called Stranger West. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep, Stranger West.
Yeah, looking forward to learning more about this. What can you tell us about your latest work?
So again, there's stories from northern Utah. As my other books have come out, more people have come to me from all over the West. I have stories from Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, and I think that some of my favorite stories today, today, are people who have run into cryptids or monsters or things that are just strange and unusual in the forests. Growing up, because of where I live in Cache Valley, kind of to explain, it's a smaller community. It's a college town with Utah State University, but one of the big draws for a lot of people is that you're only 10 minutes from the wilderness. You're 10 minutes from hiking, fishing, skiing, any of that. And that's a big draw for people. And as I grew up, the wilderness was big for me. And so because of that, a lot of my stories have been in the forest or in the mountains. And so along those lines, a lot of the stories in the next book also have to deal with the wilderness. I have one story in particular from a young man. Well, at the time he was a young man, went on a scout camp to Yellowstone, and I love Yellowstone. And this was one of the first stories that I actually heard, a paranormal story about Yellowstone. This gentleman went with his scout group, and they were telling stories around the fire, and he left to go use the restroom out in the forest. And he came face to face with a rather big black mass, a black figure in the forest that approached him while he was there, and just how he had never really thought about the paranormal before. But as this creature came towards him, and he finally was able to get his flashlight and turned on, and it disappeared with the light, and he was able to run back. But I love how in the forest, it seems to be almost an elemental view of the paranormal.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. A lot of the black masses, the shadow people that are out in the forest, almost seem to have an elemental attachment to them.
Yeah, that does make sense. And it ties in well, actually, into one of my final and most important questions here for you, John, in terms of panning out and getting that bigger perspective on this stuff. And that is based on all of your experiences and what you know today. Any big takeaways? Where does this leave you? You know, if it were to end today, what are you taking with you so far?
Well, one of the takeaways that I really wanted, it's part of why I wrote the book, because of my experience, and part of why I write the books, is to help people understand that for the vast majority, it's really not evil. It's not bad. That I love watching the paranormal shows on TV, the ghost hunters, the ghost adventurers. But a lot of people who watch that, who haven't had experiences, they're taking away. And I'm noticing this a lot when I help people who are having paranormal experiences. Their first thing they jump to is that they have a demonic entity in their house, or it's demonic, or and I really try and help people to understand, and what I want to try and take away from it is to help people understand that the vast majority are just people in general who have passed on. And just like anybody that you would meet on the street, they're good, they're bad, but for the most part, it's not an evil thing. They're just attached to either a place, a thing, or a person. Mm-hmm. and that to try and see it through and more of an exciting eyes than necessarily a scared evil kind of thing.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does, because yet again, this is another common sentiment that folks often share with me. And that is, once they've kind of reached this certain level of understanding, they then kind of want to turn around and help other people understand it better by removing some of the stigma, making it more approachable, humanizing it. And it's awesome that you're doing the same things with your books. And speaking of, John, when can I go download Stranger West to my Kindle? I'm looking forward to this.
So I'm hoping right around the middle part of August. We're just waiting for the last little bits to come through, and then it should be available both. It'll be available on Amazon through Kindle, and to get your hard copy as well.
Fabulous. I'm looking forward to that. John, where can everybody go online to check out and support your work? So
I do have a website. It's strangerbridgerland.com. Just one word, obviously. And on there, you can look up, I have my books, or connection to get my books. I have a list of all the places where I'm presenting or talking, and anywhere I've given a speech. Also a place there that you can contact me if you have a paranormal story that you'd like to share. There's a place there that you can get a hold of me, and we can set up a time to talk about your paranormal experience, or if you need any help with anything. And I've got a couple different trailers for my book on there as well that some people like to look at. And then also Beyond Stranger Bridgerland on Facebook is also where you can reach me.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to include all that info in the show notes for you. Guys, on a personal note, these books are well worth the price. They are extremely fun reads, really easy to get through, and the stories are just great. Can't recommend them enough. John, Thanks so much once again for making it on the ether. I hope we can get you back on the program really soon here, man.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. I love your program. Keep up the great work. You're doing an awesome job. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Take care, my friend.
All right, we'll see ya.
I had another amazing time talking to our guest this week. Big thanks again to John Olson for coming on and going into some depth on these stories, as well as his new book. We got kind of a sneak peek there, so really appreciate that. And of course, going into some depth on himself. I become more convinced each time I talk to an experiencer that we are a crucial component to all of this. To a materialist, maybe that sounds like arrogant, wishful thinking on my part. And though I concede that is a possibility, your argument is kind of a tired one, and life does a good enough job proving you wrong every day, so it's not really my place to correct you. Besides, I doubt many hardcore skeptics will listen to the ether, right? If they did, I would welcome that, but if not, that's okay too. But I wanted to have John on here first because I love the stories. They're interesting, they're ominous, and like I said before, they're just a lot of fun. I can't stress that part enough. They don't sound forced or contrived or embellished, at least not to me. But in general, I absolutely love doing episodes like this that cover a range of activity over a certain area. They always end up being some of my favorite shows because they leave me with so many questions, which kind of sounds backwards. I know. Aren't the answers what we want? Well, yes and no. I think sometimes we forget about all the filters we have to experience our lives through. We're hardwired, to only take in and perceive a small fraction of reality. Ironically, these filters are what keep us alive. And if I didn't know any better, I'd say it's like it was designed that way. Who or what created that design is indeed a fantastic question, but I'm afraid we don't have room for the biggest question of all time in this outro here. It does leave me to wonder, though, what else are we not seeing? Science is moving closer and closer to declaring that our brains aren't creating consciousness like we once thought. They're receiving it, akin to a radio, tuning into a signal, a frequency. Who or what is sending the signal? Again, a logical question. If we're not, maybe it's God. Maybe it's the natural laws of the universe. Maybe in some ways it's both. It's funny to speculate on that, though, because we don't even really know what we are. The irony there just knocks me out. I often have to just tune it all out because I can't stomach everybody's smug certainty. Forgive me for my skepticism, but when it comes to the age-old mysteries of the universe, you should probably have some extraordinary evidence if you expect anybody to kind of go all in. I'm not saying everybody's wrong. A lot of people could be right. For instance, people die, yet their essence continues to exist and experience amazing things outside the body after death, then return to their physical bodies to tell the tale. Can everyone just shut out all the other noise for a second? If anything around you is distracting your attention right now, tune it out. I want to say that one more time. People die, but their essence continues to exist and experience amazing things outside the body after death, then return here. Don't believe me? Dig in and do the research. It's all there. That's enough for an entire season by itself. The other stuff is just icing on the cake. I'm amazed by these things, and I can't help but think that the people who experience them have some of the most valuable insights available to humankind, but so many of us are just too busy or distracted to pay attention. Maybe a lot of us just aren't ready to face it. We all progress and evolve at our own pace. 10 years ago, I know I wasn't ready. Life was still way too confusing and chaotic. I had no time for it. I had to go through some things to arrive where I stand today, but to go your entire life oblivious to or willingly shutting these things out as impossibilities, it's tragic. Again, you don't have to believe anything. Belief is such a big word. You shouldn't just throw that around anyway. It's so absolute and final. It leaves no room for other possibilities. And I don't know about you, but I hate feeling boxed in. I want that space and that freedom to consider all possibilities at will, or say, you know what, I was wrong. And a lot of people, for whatever stupid reason, have a pretty tough time saying that, right? All I know for certain is I know nothing for certain. It's a weird place to be at first, but you get used to it. It's ironic because you would think the longer you live, the more you observe and absorb, the more hard answers you're going to get, but it doesn't work that way at all, does it? It's as if something is trying to tell us. It's not about the knowing. It's about letting go and admitting you don't know. Knowledge does not necessarily equate to answers. And by that token, answers do not equal knowledge. Again, weird place, but it's the only one that makes sense. And I like it. I set up camp here some time ago, and I intend to stay a while. That's Season 2, Episode 5, my friends. Thank you again for listening. If you like what you hear and you haven't made it over to Apple Podcasts yet to rate the show and leave a quick review, please do so now. We need your support, and that is the best way to show that. It would also mean a great deal if you could follow us on Spotify and look for us on Facebook and Instagram. If you have a story, message me on social media or send an email to theethershow@gmail.com. Thanks again, everybody, for joining me in the ether. We'll see you next time.